Hello info person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be discussing a potential resolution to this somewhat massive mistake. A mistake in astronomy that's literally massive because it represents an enormous object in the night skies. And so here, for over 40 years, astronomers, when studying the night skies, might have made a mistake about this enormous towering structure ballooning away from what appears to be the center of the Milky Way galaxy. And this particular feature, referred to as GCL or Galactic Center Lobe, which you also see represented right here, is actually incredibly easy to see when looking at various radio maps of the Milky Way galaxy. And so, for example, by using the map you can find in the description, you can sort of even see it yourself. It's enormous, and it appears to come from the center of the galaxy, essentially resembling a kind of a giant plume that seems to be erupting from the central supermassive black hole. Which by itself would actually kind of make sense because in the last decade, researchers have actually found additional structures, such as for example the famous Fermi bubbles, that seem to do just that. They seem to be extremely large in size and seem to emanate from the center. But these ones are basically only visible in high energy, such as gamma rays. And so here the assumption was that, well, maybe we're basically seeing something very similar but in radio light, because powerful emissions are expected to produce different wavelengths. Except that a series of more recent studies and more recent observations discovered something that nobody expected. And here the discovery is that the structure is essentially a kind of a cosmic equivalent to a giant fake mustache. Because it turns out that this galactic central lobe is neither coming from the galactic center, nor is it actually a lobe. And instead, this particular study by Crackle and a team you see right here, revealed that this is a much smaller closed loop sitting much closer to us and represents a perfect example of how a perspective can actually fool even some of the most advanced telescopes. And so in this video, we're going to finally solve this 40-year-old mystery and discuss what this actually tells us about various hidden structures inside the Milky Way galaxy. But to understand why this is a big deal, we have to go back to 1984. The year when I'm finally learning how to walk. But in a slightly different location, astronomers using radio telescopes first spotted two massive ridge-like structures extending vertically from the galactic plane. And because they were positioned exactly above the galactic center, the most logical assumption here was that they probably came from the galactic center itself. And at that time, the galactic center was being revealed as an extreme environment containing something extremely powerful. This was actually before Sagittarius A-star central black hole was officially confirmed. And so around this time, scientists discovered the now famous radio arc, or basically a series of magnetic filaments extremely close to the central core, and started to realize that this location seems to be where the central black hole is potentially hiding. And it also seems to be the source of immense power. And so for decades, they essentially fit this galactic central lobe into this picture as well, with some scientists believing that this was a magnetic flux tube somehow twisted by the galactic rotation. In other words, they believed that this was the result of some kind of a magnetic interaction that was potentially created by very powerful emissions from the central black hole interacting with the galactic magnetic fields, with other scientists arguing that this was the galactic wind, or basically represented massive outflow of gas driven by either intense star formation or previous eruptions from the central black hole, or in some sense, this was basically a very similar formation to what we actually observe in the nearby Centaurus A galaxy that we've recently discussed in one of the videos in the description. And because of the similarities in shape, this conclusion kind of made some sense. But at the same time, this was a perfect example of a typical psychological bias. In this case, astronomers focusing on certain areas in their fields tended to actually see whatever it is they were studying. And so if they were studying black holes, they assumed this was a result of a black hole as well. But if you studied magnetic fields, you expected this to be a magnetic loop. And once again, because of this 2010 discovery of the Fermi bubbles, it did make just a little bit of sense. But here, these enormous objects that stretch 50,000 light years above and below the galactic center seem to be genuinely produced by the central region, and most likely did come from either the black hole or massive star formation in the central molecular zone a few million years ago. And so because of this initial discovery, it now made sense to find more of these objects, but in different wavelengths. And so here this association was actually so strong, especially because of the location in the night skies, that for many years none of this was questioned by anyone. But as our instruments got better, certain glitches in this hypothesis started to appear, with the first clue coming from the measurements of the overall velocity. And that's because gases in the center of the galaxy normally move extremely fast, usually over 100 kilometers per second, because they're generally being whipped around by the central black hole, with the immense gravity from the entire core causing these gases to escape at very fast speeds. But when scientists looked at this structure, and specifically radio recombination lines, the very unique signal that's given off by the ionized gas in this structure, they actually found that it was moving at the snail's pace, anywhere from 0 to 10 kilometers per second. That's essentially what you're seeing in this image. And this low speed was a smoking gun that this was not in the center of the galaxy at all. It basically suggested that the entire structure was potentially much closer to us, and it was just basically in the foreground, drifting along with planet Earth, but basically placed in such a way that it appeared to be in the center of the galaxy, with the final proof coming from 3D dust mapping. And this is actually a pretty intriguing technique. And while obviously the galaxy itself is full of dust, and when this dust travels across space, it also tends to dim the light from different stars. And so by comparing the amount of dust dimming with detailed maps of where the dust is located in the Milky Way galaxy, researchers can actually figure out where it's located and basically determine the overall distance to that particular dust cloud. And so here, by comparing the amount of dust dimming coming from the GCL structure with various detailed maps that were created previously, the ones that actually show us where the dust is usually found in the Milky Way galaxy, researchers were able to estimate that the distance to this object is only about 6,500 light years away from us, or about 4 times closer than we previously thought. And in comparison, the distance to the center of the galaxy is around 27,000 light years, or 4 times as far. In other words, this was much closer to us. And additionally, by using the local volume mapper survey, they also found that we only see half of the structure. And that's because in these radio images, the bottom half of the structure blends in with a bright background from the galactic disk, and so it's actually kind of difficult to see. But the new optical maps show us that this is not an open lobe or a chimney, but instead seems to be a completely closed loop and is basically circular in shape. And because this object confused astronomers for nearly 40 years now, they even jokingly started to refer to this as Greatly Confused Loop. So once again GCL, but just a slightly different acronym. With the obvious next question being, okay, so since this is so much closer to us, and since this is still pretty big in size, what exactly is this and what created this? Well, we're now pretty certain this has nothing to do with black holes, or any kind of a black hole activity, with most of the facts now pointing at this being an extremely large H2 region, or basically an enormous hydrogen gas cloud that seems to glow under intense UV radiation, something that was actually previously hinted on in some of the other studies in the description, which makes this a massive hydrogen bubble. A bubble that's approximately 115 light years across, and most likely formed by emissions from previous generation of massive stars that used to exist somewhere in the center. But as it normally happens with these stars, they usually live extremely fast and extremely violent lives, creating massive supernova after just a few million years. And so this very likely blasted away a cavity inside the surrounding gas, in essence forming this enormous bubble. And intriguingly, this type of a bubble is actually exactly where the solar system is right now as well. In other words, this is potentially a somewhat similar structure to the famous local bubble, where the solar system currently finds itself after approximately 7 million years of travel. And so this is just another one of these massive bubbles produced by enormous supernova millions of years ago. And as we know from this bubble, here these extremely powerful emissions tend to create a lot of shock waves, with this feedback then triggering star formation along the edges of the bubble itself. And wherever these stars form, they essentially start to ionize a lot of gas, which then basically starts to glow and become visible in these observations. And so in other words, all of these that you see right here, these are extremely likely emissions from newly formed stars that ionize a lot of gas around them. Although since this is pretty far away from us, trying to find these stars can be pretty challenging. And this structure is actually extremely similar to the famous Barnard's loop, a giant bubble of gas created by stellar activity inside the famous Orion Nebula. Except that in this case, unlike the Barnard's loop, this unusual structure seems to be right in front of the Galactic Center, which is why it confused astronomers for 40 years. And so this study serves as a really good example of how a lot of things in outer space are just so difficult to measure, because measuring distances can be challenging and does involve extremely specific observations. And since we're inside the galaxy, looking through various layers of stars and dust, this makes things even more difficult and can lead to assumptions that create errors that we basically take for granted for several decades. But by correcting this mistake, astronomers can now stop trying to explain this as some kind of a black hole emission and instead focus on explaining this as a result of supernova and stellar formation, while at the same time showing us that these types of giant bubbles seem to be quite common and seem to be an important part of how our galaxy works in general. In other words, just like the local bubble, this is basically kind of like the breathing of the galaxy itself. Stars are being born, they explode, they clear the space for the next generation, and the cycle starts over once again. And so the science used to discover and confirm this is a perfect testament that this field of galactic archaeology is only getting better and better at understanding the Milky Way. But at least for now, that's all I wanted to mention. Once there's some additional discoveries about the Milky Way, we'll come back and discuss this more in some of the future videos. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.